Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch. Hello, Ben.
G'day, mate. How are you?
I'm very good. Hey, listen, last week we had a really good episode, which I enjoyed to sort of give a bit of the backstory, a few frameworks, and
your fifth birthday.
Fifth birthday. It was a nice little milestone for us to celebrate. But we talked about how we had this really cool framework, which we are just going to do a quick pause on that.
Yep.
And we're going to push that over to next week.
Yes.
Because we thought it might be topical and relevant and current for us to talk about. Obviously, the main topic of discussion in the vernacular at the moment, Ben, which is, of course, the coronavirus.
Yep.
Because I think in terms of a community, we want to sort of, we're not health experts, we're not going to pretend we're health experts, but we want to sort of maybe send a message of calm around what's going on, because it is affecting everyone's mind at the moment. So we thought, folks, we will do that next week. We actually do have a top 5 frameworks for property investors that really shows how the frameworks that we were working on all coming together, Ben.
Yep.
So this is an amazing PDF
document
that Ivis and Emma have put together with our input. So if people want to get access to that,
go to the show notes.
And I thoroughly recommend that you do.
Well, it's a great document because of the reality of when we talk about our frameworks and our top 5, there's links to the episodes that we talk about it. So it's a great shortcut. 274 episodes. Which one should I listen to? The framework ones and the top 20 are a really good start. And there's also some little downloadables in there, some little freebies as well. So please go to the show notes, grab our top 5 frameworks. It's really important. It has things, the steps to building wealth, the ABCD, rule of 25. It has, the game of property. All of them are in there. And then
it's all the ones we talked about last week.
Yep.
So there are 2 hacks. So it's thepropertycouch.com.au/frameworks, Ben.
Yep.
But there's 2 PDFs that you can download. One I talk about at the end of every episode, which is the big life hack to get the gold from the first 20 episodes.
Yep.
This here is another life hack for those people who joined the community late, where you can actually really get up to speed super quick. So folks, propertycouch.com.au/frameworks.
So Bryce, as a scene setter, because what we want to do in today's show, it's a different show, it's off programming, is to try and scene set first with the facts, okay? And then we're going to talk about the economic impact, and then we'll go into what it means for property and property prices. So that's the plan. So shout out to the 7:30 program, because we're going to be using a bit of their content, because it was really a community service announcement and separating fact from fiction. Because if we go by the movies and we go by the books of fear and what happens when contagions and all that break out. So our purpose of sharing this information today is really about saying we want to make sure that history doesn't follow that pathway, because ultimately as human beings we are responsible for our actions, and if our actions are rational actions, then there shouldn't be anything to see here. But if we continue to act irrationally and do things that we wouldn't normally do in our regular day behaviours, from an economic point of view, that's going to be severe. So we're going to get to that. So let's go firstly to the Chief Medical Doctor from the ABC explaining the facts in regards to SARS. So let's cut to that now.
When a new virus is introduced into the human population, there's a risk that disinformation can take hold. And that's not only unhelpful, but potentially dangerous. The ABC's Dr. Norman Swan explains.
In most parts of Australia, we live cheek by jowl. And when something hits that could spread quickly through the community, fear dominates. What's fiction and what's reality? SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is new to humans, almost certainly having spread directly or indirectly from bats. Most new infections originate in animals. Some, like avian flu, don't spread easily, while others like SARS, swine flu, and this new coronavirus do. There's a lot we still don't know about this coronavirus, including being sure about how it spreads.
We know that it is probably spread by both the droplet and the airborne route, which is respiratory transmission. It is also spread by contact, most likely, which means if someone coughs or sneezes on a surface and you put your hand on that surface and then touch your face, you can get infected.
It's hard to get by without touching anything, so people are wondering what's better, an alcohol-based hand sanitizer or soap? Well, hand washing with soap is probably best because it removes the fat layer on your skin which holds the virus. But hand sanitizer is a very good runner-up. Masks are pointless. Your chances of walking past a person with the illness or being on the same train or bus as them are not much higher than winning the lottery. So by wearing masks, you're unnecessarily using a resource that's needed for health workers who'll be directly exposed to infected patients, and needed for people with the illness to cut the chances of them spreading it.
People over the age of 60 or 65 and people with underlying health conditions are at greater risk of severe disease.
We know who's most susceptible to it, but what are your chances of actually dying from this coronavirus? This is called the case fatality rate. That's the proportion of people who die compared to the number infected. The consensus at the moment is that on average there's a 2% chance of succumbing. But that's not the whole story. The number of people infected is underreported. That's because people with mild or no symptoms are often missed. No one knows the real number, but it's likely that the true case fatality rate is 1%. But that's still 10 times the case fatality rate of seasonal flu. But your individual risk actually depends on your age and health. If you're young and healthy, it's almost zero. If you're older and have other illnesses, such as heart disease, diabetes, and lung disease, the fatality rate is closer to 15%. There are no treatments for COVID-19, though some are being tested. The death rate may come down with advanced hospital intensive care and a vaccine, but that might be a year away. In the meantime, what should you do if you think you have COVID-19? Symptoms can be mild or flu-like: fever, cough, sore throat, fatigue, and shortness of breath. If you think you might have the virus, seek medical attention, but it's important to call ahead to tell your doctor about your symptoms, travel history, or possible contacts. There's also a national helpline on 1800 020 080.
So Bryce, there we have the medical doctor from the ABC just basically outlining the facts. So what was interesting for me there was the fact that a lot of people are experiencing very mild symptoms that have been diagnosed, but there could be a lot of people out in the community who, especially in China and alike, who have had very mild symptoms but don't report, and just, so they don't become a statistic. So the reality is the mortality rate is probably, you said it, it's definitely lower. So it's reason for awareness, and from my point of view, I've seen some images on the TV. I think the media has a role to play here, a really important role to play. They're showing images of people in Iran who are stumbling across the street and collapsing.
It's not helpful.
It's absolutely
not
helpful, right? Because one, we don't know what's happened. We don't know whether that's file footage, whether it's real footage, that, because they're getting it off the social media reels or whatever. That plays in to the irrational psychology of humans, and they react, irrational. There's some great studies on this. If we think about what studies have been done. So I'll give you an example, right? You can find these everywhere across the web, but university studies where 6 people are put in a room and 5 people are in on it, and the 6th person has a hidden camera, and they're following their reactions in terms of, and so they're asked a question, and that question might be, what's 10 plus 10? And the answer is obviously 20. But so this person's sitting there going, big smile on his face, relaxed, comfortable, and they work through the list of the people. And here's the last one on the corner, and he goes 21, 21, 21, and you can just see him looking around, going, what, like in his mind. So, what? And he goes, I'm a little bit. Is it 21? Like, so, so there is that type of behaviour and that type of thing. I don't know what the technical name that they gave it, but it's definitely something that we look at. And the same sort of thing when we see images, again, coming back to the media, of people going into supermarkets. Let's talk about the toilet paper.
Toilet paper gate.
Let's get the toilet paper gate right going. So what's happening here is exactly the same thing. So what we're seeing is basically rational people, right, who are going to the supermarket, going about their business, and then seeing other people's trolleys with 1 or 2 big bags of toilet paper. Now, they are normally rational people. They then go and have it, and now it's a bulky good, so it looks worse than it does. You might only, whereas you might have hundreds of packets of soup, you can have only maybe 20 or 30 big box, and then the whole sort of row or aisle looks like it's empty. So you get this situation, right, where, so I'm going over them thinking, well, if everybody else is doing it, I'm going to have an irrational moment because I'm I love watching it on planes where people are trying to put their stuff in the overhead baskets and when they're trying to get off the plane and they're like, they just don't act rationally. They don't act calm. People collecting their bags from the carousel. It's hilarious, right? Yeah. But we do act in sort of mob group sort of behaviour. So because we know our listeners are rational people. Correct. And our job is to try and help them calm the rest of the community in terms of what this looks like.
Yeah, because it's really about making the invisible visible, because most people are just looking at what you say before, the images that they're seeing on the media, and they're going, I actually don't know what I'm dealing with here. So therefore, the only logical response that I should have if I don't understand what it is to follow what everyone else is doing.
All of a sudden that feels rational behaviour because everyone else is doing it.
But the challenge with that is it could quickly become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you actually made a very good point that we are talking to a very rational group of people.
Yeah.
And it's our intention today with this podcast is to say a couple of things. One, we are by no stretch health professionals whatsoever.
None.
But we've actually observed a couple of things around human contagion that happens. And if that human contagion does happen, it would actually cause the very thing that people are fearful of, which is the economy to go into landslide. So effectively, if I was to get the flu in seasons gone past, no one's going to see that as panic. They're going to see that as, okay, a certain percentage of the population gets the flu and a certain percentage of the population in rare cases would have some form of fatality around that, right?
Yep.
So no different. So I guess really in the absence of the facts and absence of the visible, this is being invisible, people are not necessarily applying that rational thought to this, because the challenge is that it is highly contagious, right? That's the challenge.
Yep.
But the facts are, according to an expert, Ben, not according to you and me, the facts are that it's not causing the amount of fatalities that people will be conjuring up in their mind.
So, Raz, I reckon that's a perfect segue into going to someone who also was on the 7:30 program. So again, acknowledging the 7:30 for this community announcement, 7:30 report for this community announcement. So let's cut to this piece of the special report that they did last night on the coronavirus in regards to an actual expert in vaccinations and this type of disease spreading. So we'll cut to that now.
The Johns Hopkins Centre for Health Security in the United States is one of the world's leading authorities on pandemics and emerging infectious diseases. One of its senior scholars, Dr. Emer Shadulja, joined me earlier from Pittsburgh. Dr. Adulja, why do these viruses seem to spring up out of nowhere?
It's not that viruses tend to spring up out of nowhere. It's just that we are very poor at surveying unknown infectious diseases. And we know that there are many viruses in animal species that have the capacity to jump into humans. And the issue becomes, how good are we at diagnosing infectious diseases? When there are cases of unexplained pneumonia or unexplained cases of sepsis in a hospital, how often do we actually pursue those cases to their final diagnosis? And the answer is not very often. And we really need to get better at surveying human populations for unexplained illnesses so that these don't seem like they're coming out of the blue, because there really are signals that we're missing.
As you say, people will remember other respiratory pandemics like SARS and MERS. Do successive events like this get worse in terms of mortality and severity, or are they just different?
Each of these events is different because each virus has different characteristics. So if you look back at SARS in 2003, it had about a 10% fatality rate, and it was something that wasn't very transmissible between humans. It only caused about 8,000 infections. MERS has a much higher mortality rate of about 30%, but it again is also not very efficient in transmitting between humans. It's primarily transmitted from camels to humans. And this virus seems to be different in the sense that it's not nearly as fatal as either SARS nor MERS, but it is something that transmits more like what we call our community-acquired coronaviruses that cause about a quarter of the cases of the common cold. And that's why we're seeing this virus really take off, because it has that capacity to spread very well. And just because it can spread so well, that's really going to make it a burden on populations, because if it infects a large population, a large proportion of the population, even a very low mortality rate can be substantial because of the number of people that are infected.
Is it possible that some people will just have cold-like symptoms and never even realise that they've had coronavirus?
It's definitely true that the majority of cases are going to be very mild, and many will be indistinguishable from the common cold, which makes it much harder to actually diagnose these cases without diagnostic tests, because the symptoms are so nonspecific. Fevers, cough, sore throat, runny nose, sneezing. Those are the symptoms of the common cold, and that makes sense because coronaviruses are a major cause of the common cold, and this one can cause common cold-like symptoms in a large majority of patients, and only a very small minority get severe symptoms such as pneumonia.
Does a country like Australia have much natural protection because of its geography?
There's often something said that island nations tend to be much more insular when it comes to infectious disease threats, that they're able to fend them off and protect themselves more. But I don't think that's the case with an island like Australia, because that is a very cosmopolitan nation that has individuals from all over the world. And we know that this virus had been spreading since at least November in China. So that was a long head start that this virus had to spread all over the world. So I don't think that Australia will be spared from this infectious disease, just like any other country in the world.
And how far away is a vaccine for coronavirus?
Vaccine development is measured in years often, and sometimes even decades. I do think that we're moving rapidly with this vaccine, and we hopefully will have enough vaccine, if everything goes perfectly, in about 12 to 18 months to vaccinate those at-risk populations in the world.
Dr. Emer Shidulja, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So Bryce, I want to pick up on his last point because that's the most important point, right? So if this is an event that has a peak and a trough, and that peak and trough might be 12 to 18 months, because usually what will happen, and again, I'm not a health expert and I'm not a pandemic expert, but once there is treatments or preventions, or they start to work out a way in which they can improve the mortality rate, that type of information then flows through and people feel more comfortable. So this is a crisis or could be a crisis of confidence. At the moment, it's not there yet, but that's what we wanted to talk about, because once that gets there, then all of a sudden we're out the other side of it, and then the world's back to where it was. So how hard we bottom out has everything to do. Directly proportional to the people's behaviour and response right now.
Yep.
So if you are going to go this weekend and buy a mattress or buy a new bed or do those types of things, then the reality is if you don't do that and everyone follows suit and the spending stops, then the correction in the economy, because I want to make a really important point here, uncertainty is the cause of economic retraction or economic slowdown. If you have fear and you stop behaving like you were going to behave, because at the end of the day, GDP and our economic activity is the measure of what every one of us do. And so when we see the share market volatility that we've been experienced and that how affects us, and we've talked about wealth effect before, so that has definitely been material in terms of the changes in the share market, but the property market is a little bit different. And that's why we've always liked property.
It's an essential need, Ben.
It's an essential need. We're going to live somewhere, and you know, even though there is going to be a mortality rate and there will be more fatalities in Australia, the question is, and this is a question that I'm running through my mind in terms of my confidence in moving forward, and now I'm going to get into a little bit of, well, that's tough. It's a tough conversation, but the likelihood of both parties in one house dying is unlikely. And so I'm talking about supply and demand here, right? I've got to think about it in terms of, we're here as a property podcast and we're experts in the property market. So what's the likelihood of that happening to increase the enormous supply that we need for the pent-up demand that's currently in the marketplace? Now, that says to me, with a mortality rate of 1% and potentially going to go down further, it's not going to have a material effect on property prices if the demand continues to maintain. If demand stops and everyone just stops spending, that will exacerbate the slowdown. Now, at the moment, we're not even in a slowdown. You know, CoreLogic reports that, you know, the property market in Australia surged by 1.1% in February, and you're out in the field. Tell us about what's happening out in the field.
Mate, there is a lot of competition out in the field, right? So, what's interesting is that what is our response? We will still be buying, Ben. Our team will still be buying.
Totally.
And if people, there will be an opportunity, because if people are actually not going to turn up at auctions this week, you're actually playing into the hands of the professional buyers like us. Correct. Because it's just removing the demand.
Yep.
In a market that probably has a little bit of sizzle in it that could probably have a little bit removed, right? So, and if you have been a student of our podcast for a long time, when we're buying for the long time, right? So we're seeing opportunities.
Yeah, long term.
Where nothing else has changed, Ben. We've still got population in this country that is positively wanting to move here. We're still undersupplied in a few key markets, and at best balanced supply in others. So those things haven't changed. But if you were to have a buffer in place, Ben, if you were to buy the right asset, Ben, if you were to make sure that you didn't put yourself in a position where you were vulnerable for buying, there's still no logical reason other than invisible fear of the monster under the bed. And I don't know what the monster under the bed is, because you know what the monster under the bed is, Ben? There's actually, I don't survey any kid who had the monster under the bed, and now that they're an adult, ask them if there was ever a monster under the bed, and the answer is always no, Ben. The monster was in their head.
Yes.
The monster was in their head, Ben.
Not under the bed. Love it. Love the advice. I mean, we've got to acknowledge that depending on what industry you're in. So if you're in tourism, and education to some degree, and you thought that. In education, most people won't get laid off because they're government supported.
The universities,
Whereas if you're in tourism right now, I wouldn't necessarily think that getting into more debt, if your job security isn't there, is a good thing for you.
Correct.
I'd be looking at the industry that you're in and seeing basically how insular you are in regards to taking on that debt. If you feel confident in that sense, then it's business as usual. But I come back to that point before, and I know we were a little bit, talking of a difficult subject around a population decline, because people will die from this. It'll become part of, it'll spread to be in the norm in our society over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, if it has such a high contagion rate or transfer rate. So we've just got to expect that. And then, what will happen is there will be, just like, every year Jane and me and the boys, we get our flu shot. That is going to also protect us. So there'll be a mixture, or the vaccine will be part of that. That will also, because it is part of that corona family, as we heard from the doctors there, basically saying that it's flu-like, and that's how it transfers. So I think from my point of view, if we are talking about an 18-month question mark, then buy for the long term. I mean, what we have seen is also there has been some really good supply actually hitting the market. So people are in the mindset of upgrading, downgrading, moving, because the market's back in flow. And so if we get that market back in flow, if ever, as you say, no one turns up to the auction, we're going to be picking some pretty good properties.
We'll still be there.
And we're going to be buying them pretty well. And if you're not going to be selling them in the next 18 months, what's nothing to see here, right? So, and I think, but like everyone who's in that phase is going to be asking themselves, is it still the right time? I mean, we have that moment of fear, that moment of uncertainty. So I think it's worthy of asking a professional in terms of their opinion. Now, their opinion may have a bias to it, but if you think longer term, in terms of what's happened post-GFC, and if I make reference to the last correction that we've just had in Sydney and in Melbourne, what does tend to happen is, because we've been at this level before, we move pretty quickly back into new territory, right? So what did we correct in Sydney? About 14% overall. We're now back up about 10.9% of that correction. So the reality is, well, I know that years ago, only 18 months or two and a half years ago, that property was worth that. So I know that that's the level that it potentially can get to. And if I can also say, I was saying before, this respite is actually pretty healthy. It might just balance that market out so we don't get this FOMO that we were starting to see come back into the market as well. So if 2 or 3 buyers drop off on every property, there's still 2 or 3 probably still there at the moment. So I still think there's going to be healthy competition, but I don't think they'll go to the heady heights that they were going to and just risk everything to get that property because they wanted to.
No, and it's an important point you make, because if you said if 2 or 3 people drop off, you're still okay because there's still 2 or 3 people still standing.
Yeah.
So, because that then comes back to what asset are you actually, what auction are you, what house are you standing out in front of at the auction depends on what the selection is that you've made. Yeah. So, well, there you go, folks. We certainly are aware that there is a little bit of contagion that's going on. Ben, the government is, we had Nerida on earlier this week. I chatted with her and she talked about, I said, what was the precedent previously with swine flu and SARS? And she said after SARS, there was a dip in growth, and then the following growth, the government went on a spending package to stimulate the economy. What we do know is the government has been keen to get a surplus to show their fiscal credentials, but they have, on the face of it, a crisis, which gives them a bit of a license to actually respond. And so they'll be responding to that as well, which will flow money through the economy. They want to do that prior to the coronavirus coming into fruition anyway, because obviously there was the bushfire issues and the economy was a little bit sluggish prior to that. But even despite all that, the property market was still responding north, largely driven by owner-occupiers, largely driven by the top end of the segment in Sydney and parts of Melbourne. So
it's not immune to economic slowdowns, but the fundamentals are still pretty good. You have to live somewhere and people still aspire to be in those particular things. And we know this will pass. We know that there will be a vaccination. We know that that the health carers will get better and better at treating this as they learn more and more about it. So if you think over the horizon, I think you've got yourself into a pretty sound position. And that's my message.
Yeah, so one thing, Ben, is what I like the phrase is it shouldn't be a question of should I buy or should I not buy. Yeah. It's a question of, and just for the record, Ben, this applies all the time, but just in the face of this, the question is not should I be buying property. The question is where is it that the conditions exist that I should be buying? Because Australia is one big market. No, it's not. It is made up of hundreds of sub-markets. So there is, if you think about Darwin and Perth have been on the nose for a while, but Sydney and Melbourne going up, Adelaide's had a run, then you had Hobart. There is always somewhere in this country, given how diverse and how much population is, there is always somewhere that you should be buying. There is never a time when it's not a good time to buy property in this country. There are optimal periods if you want to actually time the market as well as combine that with time in the market. But there is always somewhere where you could be buying.
I'll use another example, Bryce. In the Second World War, we know that those 2 little mini submarines came in and bombed the ships in Woolloomooloo there in the bay. And what happened to all of the eastern suburbs property prices on the water there?
They would have diminished. Ben.
They went south in a fear and uncertainty. And why do I want to be near the coast? Yeah. I mean, I could be bombed from the Japanese. Yep. So, and now some of the most prime real estate in Australia.
Yes.
So that's the sort of stuff that goes on. So the day-to-day news cycle is going to be difficult not to follow. This is the thing. Be vigilant. Wash your hands. Try and
wash your hands. Absolutely. Make sure.
Do all the things you can. Don't over panic. That's not worth panicking about.
Hey Ben, think about the people who live in Indooroopilly in Brisbane.
Yeah.
I wonder how often they think about the fact that their suburb went underwater. Yeah. Some of the areas on that western side went underwater. Like at the time, there was people. I've got a mate who bought a property in Indooroopilly for about $300,000 under what the market value was. Yeah. You couldn't do that anymore, but it was essentially about remembering what's in front of us now versus what seems like a long time ago.
All right. So my messages, because I've just got a couple. All right. Here they are. Don't stop doing what you're doing. Right. keep doing exactly what you said you're going to do. It's important not only to recover from our drought, so we've seen some great rainfall coming through Queensland there. That's brilliant news for those in those drought-affected areas. Their rivers are flowing, their dams are full. That's exciting. We're seeing our rural communities. We want to support them in the back of the bushfires. So keep doing that. Get out into the rural community. Spend like you said you were going to spend, and there'll be nothing to see here. If we don't do that, then we'll only exacerbate the problem. We want to be a solution to the problem. And so I'm saying to all of our beautiful, rational listeners,
spread this message.
Spread this message. You are rationally minded. You have a rational mindset. Share that love. Be calm. Pass on to those.
Reassure your friends. Reassure your networks. Reassure your communities.
All of a sudden, we will be. We've had, Asian currency crisis, SARS, everything come across our desk before. It's serious. We understand it. Acknowledge it, but power through it. Don't be a victim of it. Think glass half full, not glass half empty, and we will get out the other side pretty well.
Well said, Ben. So there you go, folks. That was our community service announcement around what is definitely the main talked about topic right now. We want to say thank you to the 7:30 report. We obviously cut some of the footage from their episode last night. We think it was very important.
Check out the whole episode if you want. It's all there.
Sticky, we're going to put that in the show notes if you want to check
the link.
Check out the link, absolutely. And folks, we will circle back next week on the framework that we've been excited to present, Ben.
Nothing like a good bit of benchmarking, Bryce.
Yes.
To set the scene for
where
the
where
year.
do you grade?
Your grade.
What is your wealth grade? So stick around for that, folks. But if you've got any feedback, let us know on the socials, Ben. But until next week,
knowledge is empowering, and we've hopefully shared some knowledge for you today. We've been here before. This too shall pass, but only if you act on it. So keep acting, people. Keep acting.
There you go, folks. Have a great week, and we will talk to you next week.
Hey there folks, Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listen to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarises the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.